Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and this time we're going to take a look at a game that's been requested of me from a few sources, and actually provided to me courtesy of a kind viewer. Talisman Digital Edition. It's a conversion of Games Workshop's Talisman board game, developed and published by Nomad Games, released on February 25th, 2014, and available on Steam along with dozens of DLC ranging from full expansions to class and card packs, as well as multi-copy packs. It includes both single-player and multiplayer options. Now, before I address the digital edition, it bears mentioning that the Talisman board game has been around since the 80s, 1983 to be exact, and is currently on its 4th edition. Like the digital edition, it has had expansions including new heroes, adventure cards, spells, etc. Starting with the 3rd edition, the Talisman board game was tied more closely with the Warhammer fantasy setting, and has in fact been translated into video game format before, back in 1985, with a version on the ZX Spectrum. So this game in general has a history, so to speak, one which I confess I have not followed. I have not played the board game, so my first real exposure to Talisman has been through this digital edition. And make no mistake, this adaptation is apparently very true to the board game. It is not a full-fledged RPG, although it certainly has RPG elements. You can build your character up, you can collect gear and spells, you can make purchases and fight enemies, but it uses a system of dice and cards that means that the randomization is a huge factor during play, so bear that in mind as we go forward. Also, I'll be focusing on the basic digital edition without any expansions. So let's start at the beginning. The title screen spends a fair amount of real estate encouraging purchase of the expansions, as well as more games from both the developer or from Games Workshop. A nice touch is in the options, that aside from the usual settings, also have an area for house rules, which allows for certain common optional rules to be put into place. It's a nice touch really, and I'd like to see more of this in other board game translations. Once into the game proper, you'll be able to set whether players are computer controlled or player controlled, and select the classes for each player. Each class has certain starting ability scores in strength, craft, lives, fate, and gold, as well as the potential for certain special abilities. For instance, warriors may roll 2 dice in battle and use the higher one, and may use 2 weapons at once. Other classes have an entirely different starting score setup and different special abilities. There are a number of classes included in the base game, and more available through expansions and class packs. Classes also determine your initial alignment and the starting tile. As far as ability scores go, strength is generally used for physical combat as well as feats of physical strength, while craft is used for spells, psychic combat, and skill challenges. Lives is basically your hit points, and you lose whenever you run out of lives, while fate points can be expended to re-roll a die during play in certain circumstances. Gold is used for a variety of purchases within the game, whether when landing on certain tiles or when certain adventure cards come up. Once your characters and players have been assigned, you get your first look at the board. Play takes place on the board with 3 concentric circles of squares. Each square has a name and an effect, and the effects become more drastic the further within the game you go. The middle of the board is where the victory condition for the board lies. This victory condition may be one of several alternate endings if you have certain expansions. Players start on the outer region, home to such places as the town, the tavern, the fields, and the graveyard. Like in the board game, there's a couple of decks, with some alternate decks added by expansions and used to dole out rewards, as well as certain items. In the core game, most of what you have to worry about is the adventure deck, which is used to generate encounters, and the spell deck, which is used when casters gain spells to randomly, yes, randomly, tell them what they can cast. I suppose if everything else in the game is random, why not? But don't think that this means the caster classes are unnecessarily weak as a result of not being able to pick their own powers, because some of those spells can really ruin your day, and might target you anywhere on the board. Oh, and just because you're playing a non-caster doesn't mean that you don't get spells. If your craft is high enough, you can certainly take advantage of a number of alternate ways to obtain spells. A typical turn starts by rolling a die to determine how far you can move, in terms of squares, with each area having a potentially different effect when you land on it. Now, a lot of those effects are generated by adventure cards, and a number of those are creatures or places that remain there either for the rest of the game or until defeated. Further, if you land on the same square as another player, you can encounter them and engage in battle instead. So it's entirely impossible for certain areas to present, shall we say, interesting options if you do decide to land on them. In most cases, if you land on a square with another player or monster, you will engage in battle. Certain classes and creatures will initiate a psychic battle, which uses your craft skill to determine your attack score. Most, however, will simply be physical combat, which uses your strength score. During the battle, each side rolls one 6-sided die, adds their relevant ability score, either strength or craft, and any modifiers from gear, spells, followers, or other local effects. Like any roll, you can use a fate point to reroll your die on this, and the one with the highest roll wins. If your opponent is a monster, then that monster is defeated, and you keep a copy of its card as a trophy. You can trade in these monster cards to boost your strength or craft scores based on the stats listed on the monster's card. For every 7 strength or craft, you can increase the equivalent ability by 1. It's sort of like earning experience and leveling up. Except without the complexity, or the ability boost to your life, or the scaling for increased ranks and the abilities, which means that once you get that score rolling, you can really start racking up bonuses. Anyway, back to combat. If it's a player, that player suffers a loss of 1 life, and you can select one of their items to take. Oh, did I forget to mention that there's items and such in this game? In true RPG fashion, you can collect equipment and items, either discovering them through adventure, looting them from other players, or being offered the chance to purchase them on certain squares. You can carry up to 4 items, and you'd better damn well keep 1 slot open, because you'll need a Talisman, the item the game is named for, in order to even enter the final square before the goal. You cannot even try to enter that end goal without one, unless under very special circumstances, and I'm only adding that because I don't know the effects of each of the events in the deck. Items can range from weapons and armor to items that are used in certain squares to single-use items that then go away after you've used them, and so on and so on. You can obtain spells, as I noted above, which you can hold up to 3 of, presuming that you have enough craft. If you have less than 3 craft, you can't hold any spells. If you have 3 craft, you can hold 1. If you have 4 or 5, you can hold 2 spells. So if you're a caster class, then it would behoove you to get 6 craft or better as soon as possible. Finally, you can gain followers, which have very specific effects, and you can have an unlimited number of these. However, the chances of you obtaining more than 1 or 2 are somewhat low. Still, they are incredibly useful, especially the mule, which allows you to carry 4 more items. Others may improve your abilities, heal you at certain squares, or grant you other abilities. During play, you can go back and forth as you explore, with the eventual goal being to get to the middle of the board. However, to do so, you have to proceed from the outer region, through the middle region, and into the inner region. And to get to the middle region, you either have to try to pass the sentinel, take a raft, or use the effect of some other card. And I have to say that right now, the sentinel is a stone-cold asshole. He's got a power of like 9 by default, and always seems to just demolish me whenever I try to pass him legitimately. He's a real gatekeeper, I guess, because the middle lands are pretty rough, but fortunately, as I mentioned, there are ways to the middle lands without having to pass him. The problem is that the middle lands and beyond are actually really hard, as I just said, so it would behoove you to wander around the outside of the board for a bit anyway. And once you've gotten to that middle region, you still have to get to the inner region. And that requires getting past the Portal of Power, which requires a check against one of your stats to open and pass through. If you fail the check, your stat is reduced, so you can easily exhaust yourself and all your built-up stats just trying to open the portal if you have a run of bad luck. In fact, although this is a board game, unless you get really lucky, there's no reason to beeline right towards the end goal. You're allowed to cross back and forth through the outer region and the middle region, and that's actually very useful, because even though there's only vague RPG elements in the game, there is a strategy in building up your abilities and power if you think about it. The main problem I have with this game, and that's fully realizing that this is a board game and not an RPG, is just how random it can be. Between the randomized cards and the randomized die rolls for movement and the randomized effects of certain cards, things can turn very quickly. Hell, even when you get to the center of the board, you may not win for quite some time. There is a house rule to check off that makes it an instant win, and there are certain optional ending cards with the expansions apparently, but under the core rules in the base game, you basically roll each turn to whittle away everybody on the board. And that's all you do while sitting on the center square, which means that you have to get there with enough time to capture it and hold it until everyone else is defeated, which could take a while with you just rolling one die each time your turn rolls around in an attempt to get high enough to do some damage, which if you're incredibly unlucky could leave you sitting there exhausted from your trek, just watching one of your opponents get closer and closer and closer, unable to do anything but roll that single damn die to try to whittle them away. Still, don't take this as me hating the game. I had a lot of fun with it, such as it is, and could see where purchasing the expansions for it would definitely be worthwhile, especially if you've got a solid group to play multiplayer with on occasion. Anyway, all of this has been based on the actual gameplay mechanics. What about the graphics and the sound? Well, graphically it's okay-ish. I mean, it really does give you the sense that you're looking down at an actual physical board game. The individual squares can be a little bit hard to tell apart from one another, so it can be difficult to count where your moves are going to be, but you don't really need to count them, since it does highlight where you can go after you've rolled the die. The tokens and cards are really well realized and easy to tell apart. Mechanically, the ability to click on things and get context-sensitive help is a real boon, especially for people like me who are not totally familiar with the mechanics. There's some background music on the intro and character selection screens as well as during play, although it is very much in the background. Also during play, the sound effects are acceptable enough, though minimal. Just enough to give you feedback, nothing really to complain about. It feels like playing a board game on a computer, which is a hell of a lot more than I can say about a lot of board game ports I've seen. So yeah, I can definitely see why this game has a solid fan base. If you've got a group you can play with regularly, I can even see why buying the 6-pack and sufficient expansions might be worthwhile. Is it for everyone who likes RPGs? Not by a long shot, especially if they're more of a fan of computer RPGs than tabletop, since it really has more in common with the latter. But I could see where it might be used as an entry point for somebody who has no idea about tabletop gaming in general, just to help to introduce them to the idea behind it. And I think I'm going to leave it at that. I know I probably haven't given this game the justice hardcore fans might say it deserves, but I think it's at least enough information to gauge whether, as a complete newbie to the game, you might be interested in taking a look at it, to say the least. You could certainly do worse with how little they're charging, and the 6-pack of the digital edition is actually still cheaper than the physical edition, so there is that. For now, this has been the RPG Crawler with my review of Talisman Digital Edition. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you've got feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content. If you want to help support the channel, get early access to videos like this, or several other perks that I'm offering, please consider checking out my Patreon at patreon.com/rpgcrawler or through the links at the end of the video and below. Until next time, take care and goodbye.